Hey loves, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Faith, and today guys, I'll be checking out a day in the life of a white slave in the Ottoman Empire. And you guys, I'm super excited as always. If you're yet to subscribe to this channel, please consider subscribing, give this video a massive thumbs up, comment, share, and all that good stuff. And without much ado, let's see what this video is all about.
Founded at the end of the 13th century in the northwest of Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire has radiated its power and its legendary institutions on almost the entire Mediterranean rim. Even today, the vestiges of this glorious era remind us of the grandeur and opulence which so well characterized this ancient Muslim empire. But they also reveal the incredible megalomania and eccentricity of these Ottoman sultans who finally led this great empire to its loss. Gargantuan expenses and excesses of all kinds, these powerful men were also known to promote the erotic slavery of white women, by keeping them in large harems where they were condemned to never leave. These poor creatures were literally sold in markets, as if they were nothing more than bags of goods exposed to the sun. We are going to make you discover this dark part of history where people could afford to buy or sell human beings, regardless of their race or color, simply for the sake of profit and greed. Let's get started. The slavery of human beings is one of the faults that have marred the history of mankind and the civilizations they have established over the ages. But as ignoble as it is, human trafficking has long been a very juicy and lucrative business, which has contributed to the excessive enrichment of many unscrupulous traders. Entire markets were dedicated to this ignominious activity, where traders bid on human beings as if they were cattle. The poor slaves were displayed in the open air, often under a blazing sun, and the bargaining could begin. African slaves were usually reserved for work in the fields, as their physical abilities and sturdiness allowed them to withstand the hard work that awaited them there. Almost all of them had been captured during raids on their villages and tribes and knew absolutely nothing of the wide world. Yet, they would be embarked on an oceanic journey that would last for months, and that would take them tens of thousands of places, from their native Africa to the wild and distant Americas. The slave trade deported millions of poor Africans to Brazil, the West Indies, but also to North America, where the slave states had their own slave markets. The southern states were great providers of slaves, since their economy was essentially based on cotton and other agricultural products, and they could thus use their slaves to cultivate their land and harvest crops. Unlike the northern states, which had turned to industry and thus had a greater need for technicians and factory workers, and thus had eventually abolished slavery in their respective territories. In any case, it was indeed the cotton plantation owners who were sixth biggest winners of the slave trade. And it is interesting to note that the most of them were snow-white Europeans, literally, but certainly not figuratively. That said, slavery was not only limited to black people, as this vile trade almost encompassed all races and colors, of course, in different proportions, and even age was not important to the greedy eyes of the slave traders, since one could just as easily find child slaves who were mercilessly torn from their mothers to sell them to the highest bidder. For the white slaves, it was a completely different matter. Slave traders found that young white women often aroused a strong desire in the hearts of their wealthy customers, who could then spend lavishly and pay top dollar to acquire them. The bids went up even higher when the girls were barely out of their teens and still had the beauty and purity of their youth. And since their owners considered them as luxury goods or as real valuables, these young women were treated much better than the rest of the slaves. Thus, while the black-skinned slaves were dressed in rags and were exposed with chains on the ground, the the white female slaves were much better off. They were well dressed and perfumed, and they were of course protected from the harsh climate and the wandering hands by umbrellas and guards who surrounded them with guns in their hands. Most of these women had been captured and brought there by the terrible barbarian pirates who sowed terror in the Mediterranean Sea during the 16th and 17th century. These bloodthirsty corsairs used to carry out raids on land and sea, attacking every village or ship flying the Christian flag, and taking the youngest and most beautiful women as booty. These women would then end up in the slave markets in Algiers or Tunis and would probably be bought back by Ottoman emissaries and traders. At that time, the Ottoman Empire was practically at its peak, controlling a large part of Southeast Europe, Central Europe, Western Asia, the Caucasus, and North Africa. The barbarian privateers who came from the Great Maghreb were therefore considered vassals of the Ottoman Empire, and it was indeed under their blessing that they could attack European and Christian ships. Strengthened by this formidable protection, the corsairs did not hesitate to push their raids inland, the coasts having been deserted by their occupants for a long time already. Emboldened by their successive victories, the barbarian pirates pushed their lightning raids almost to the coasts of Iceland and Great Britain. Of course, the main purpose of these raids was to capture Christian slaves to feed the Ottoman trade, although some slaves were taken to North Africa to serve the Arabs. This Barbary slave trade was behind a real Holocaust that affected hundreds of thousands of Europeans who were captured and sold in markets in North Africa and the rest of the Ottoman Empire. Some of them ended their lives as servants for the families of notables, while others went to swell the harems of the pashas and Ottoman sultans. The most beautiful women were in fact reserved to fill the numerous seraglio owned by the dignitaries of the Ottoman regime, and those of them who possessed the most beautiful feminine assets and who had the noblest family lineage were directly sent to the Sultan himself and were immediately locked up in his personal harem, under the close guard of vigilant and faithful eunuchs. These sublime white women would then have to spend their lives cloistered in a palace, never being able to leave it, and no mortal was allowed to see or speak to them, except the Sultan and his eunuchs. They will have to spend most of their lives satisfying the libidinous desires of the Sultan, and to be as docile and gentle as possible to hope to become his favorite, because within the harem there was a hierarchy that depended only on the favors of the Sultan, and the favorite woman of the latter was thus almost the boss of all the other women of the seraglio. She was the one who always had the last word and the most influence, and the closer she was to the Sultan, the more authority she could have. The astonishing history of the different Ottoman dynasties has taught us that some of the Sultan's concubines even had the right to give birth to the heir to the empire. Although they were still technically a slave in their own right, these women who became mothers of the Sultan acquired almost absolute power within the Ottoman Empire, and they received the title of validated sultana, which gave them immense authority, which far exceeded that of the viziers or other pashas. So to claim this title, the young slaves of the harem would sometimes even go so far as to kill each other, only being able to be separated by the eunuchs who were forced to intervene before it degenerated into a massacre. And this kind of scene was commonplace in most harems and seraglio of sultans. But the slavery of whites within the Ottoman Empire did not only concern Christian women destined for harems and sexual exploitation, for it is necessary to know that the Ottoman state had curious practices, one in particular, the Devshirme, which literally means collection or harvest, and which consisted in taking young Christian children from the Balkans and Anatolia from their families. These young boys were then converted to Islam and trained to become future soldiers in the powerful Ottoman army, but not just any soldiers. They were enrolled in the Janissaries, an elite unit that had become almost legendary for its achievements on the battlefields, especially during the Ottoman Ottoman invasions on Europe. Many of these young boys even became very high-ranking soldiers in the military commander of the Ottoman forces, and some of them even had the opportunity to fight decisive battles. Another amazing feature of the Ottoman slave system was the slaves, after being freed, could occupy positions at the forefront of Ottoman politics. In its territorial and military heyday, the majority of Ottoman government officials were thus freed former slaves. These former slaves were immensely wealthy and owned dozens or even hundreds of slaves. The height of irony. Slaves of African origin called Sanges had a status that was generally lower than that of European and Caucasian slaves. The latter, mostly from the Great Lakes region of Africa and Central Africa, were employed by the army as slave soldiers or in the personal service of some notable person in the city. Some of them nevertheless managed to be freed and to climb the ladder of Ottoman society, even reaching positions of great responsibility within the empire. Even today, tens of thousands of Afro-Turks, direct descendants of these Sanj slaves of the Ottoman Empire, live in present-day Turkey and even have a cultural organization to represent them. Slavery among the Ottomans was thus rather watered down in the sense that slaves were ultimately treated rather well compared to other corners of the globe, as was the case, for example, in the Americas. The poor black slaves who found themselves in America suffered from particularly degrading and inhumane treatment and had to toil for hours harvesting cotton or sugar cane under a blazing sun and the lashes of the plantation foremen. The condition of these unfortunate slaves was thus extremely more worrying than that of the Sanjis, who were sold to the Ottomans and who were treated much better. It was strictly forbidden to harm the slaves, and, on the contrary, they had to take good care of them and make sure that they never lacked anything. Unfortunately, the owners of the cotton and sugarcane plantations in the Americas were not as scrupulous. The poor slaves who fell into their hands were therefore doomed to live a real ordeal throughout their existence. They had to survive a journey across the Atlantic Ocean that could last more than 2 months, and where they were crammed by the hundreds in the holds of the ship. These poor unfortunates suffered from the intolerable conditions caused by the humidity and rot that reigned in this confined area. A great majority of them will end up getting sick, and many of them will die before reaching their final destination. And for those who were lucky enough to survive the hellish journey, their fate was no happier than that of their comrades thrown into the sea. No punishment, no matter how degrading or cruel, was spared, and their despicable owners literally had the right of life and death over their slaves. In most of the southern states of America, slaves were indeed considered as inert merchandise belonging to their owner, who could therefore dispose of them as he saw fit. We will spare you the sordid details of the torture and flogging sessions these poor creatures were subjected to, because it will surely give you nightmares at night. Nevertheless, this period where slavery was commonplace is probably one of the worst pages in the history of humanity. Millions of people suffered physically and psychologically for the sole purpose of enriching a small minority who held the power.
Wow, you guys, I'm so dumbfounded after listening to this piece of history. I don't even know what to say, because I'll just say this, that the heart of man is desperately wicked. How can you be so wicked, so inhuman to a fellow human being? This is so sad. Wow, people really went through a lot during those dark ages of slavery. It was so brutal, so intense. Wow, this is not good at all. This is absolutely not a good one, and I feel so sad right now after hearing what the slaves have to go through, and even those that they just have to throw them at sea, or those who died at sea while being transported. They really went through a lot, and this is such a sad one. I really had fun reacting to this video. If you totally enjoyed watching, give this video a massive thumbs up, comment, share, and all that good stuff. And this is me officially signing out. I'll see you guys in my next one. Bye guys.